Health Foundation, where I have the awesome opportunity to build the capacity of community-based leaders, organizations, and coalitions. And I also oversee our portfolio of giving around civic health, which is how we see communities coming together to tackle some of our toughest challenges, which is something certainly that we're working on today, that we see today especially. I'm a native Arizonan. I was born and raised in Southern Arizona, one of 6 kids of 2 parents who were farm workers who picked cotton before there was great machines. Huge family. And we grew up of pretty modest means, but my parents were so determined that each of us 6 kids, at the very least, complete all of K through 12. All 6 of us did. I ended up going on to the University of Arizona, becoming the first in my family to do so. And shortly after that, moved up to Phoenix, where I've been working in the nonprofit and advocacy sector, and just so deeply believe in the mission of all in education. So glad to be here.
Thanks, David. Dr. Pizarro?
Hi, everyone, and Danny, thanks for having me. So I'm Jasenia Pizarro. I'm an associate professor in the School of Criminology and Criminal Justice at Arizona State University. My day job involves studying firearm violence, particularly as it relates to intimate partner homicides and the homicide victimization of youth in urban settings. I am originally from Puerto Rico. I was born in the islands, but grew up in New Jersey. My parents moved from the island to New Jersey when I was 5, and I lived there most of my life. So I like to call myself, I'm a proud Jersey Rican. I'm New York Rican, I'm a proud Jersey Rican. In terms of my background, we also grew up, I grew up in a very modest background. I actually grew up in public housing. And I am a first gen student as well. So my parents have also worked really hard to get me to where I am right now. And now, as a PhD in criminology and criminal justice, I'm happy to be part of the few. I mean, we only make up 2.37% of all the tenure stream faculty in the field of criminology and criminal justice, so I'm happy to represent.
Well, thank you. Thank you both for being here, and thank you for representing really proudly each of your backgrounds and heritages. So let's go ahead and dive right into some of those identity aspects. Yes, Zenia, if we can start with you this time. When it comes to your specific identity, thinking more about your growing up, your experiences growing up in both Puerto Rico and New Jersey, when do you first remember that race was that you were of a different race, or perhaps the identity that you used to describe yourself at this time?
You know, it didn't really hit me till I went to college. So when I went to college, I started my academic career in Seton Hall University, and there was literally no one like me. So that's when it started to hit me that, I'm not in Newark, New Jersey anymore. But it really didn't have that much of an impact until I was 26. I had just graduated and earned a PhD and moved to Michigan to start my career as a professor. And when I got there, it was quite a culture shock because there were no Puerto Ricans. Literally, I looked up in the census. I was like, where were the Puerto Ricans here? And I found like 47 Puerto Ricans. And I was like, where are they? And it was not until I was in that Midwest environment that I felt different, because luckily growing up in the place that I was in New Jersey, there was a lot of diversity and there were a lot of people like me, and you could go to the bodega and get whatever you need. And that move to Michigan was life altering to me because I noticed how different I was and how people perceive us. I never really saw that until my adulthood.
Right. And so I certainly want to come back to the perception piece. But David, how about you? Any memories of some of your earliest experiences when it comes to race and your own acknowledgement of the differences?
Yeah, I can't think of any particular time in my childhood, because growing up in rural Southern Arizona, it was generally a diverse community.
Right.
Um, Certainly, it was a farming community, a ranching community. So there were a lot of white folks, but because of farming and agriculture, there was a lot of migrant farm workers. So that was omnipresent. And we actually had a really large Asian American population and also African American population. And if you know my hometown of Marana, you know it's it's huge space. It spans a lot of land, and it's kind of separated into different neighborhoods. And I guess you can call that a bit of segregation. So there's certainly a Black neighborhood. There there's a village called Yon Pueblo where it's a kind of village of the Pasquayaki tribe. And then there were certain areas where there were more white people than Latino people. And in the neighborhood where I grew up, we grew up in trailers, double wide, single wides, not kind of your traditional home you see now, but it was just a different space. And I didn't really think of or acknowledge kind of race or ethnicity in that kind of sense. But I think the first time that I really thought about how I was specifically connected with that was actually connected to my name. So I use my suffix a third, and that's become so important to me for a lot of reasons. And that was because during school, there was actually another David Martinez in my school who wasn't as good of a student as I was.
Okay.
And punctual with attending class and actually going to school. So his tardy and absentee record sometimes ended up on mine, and my mom got a pretty surprise phone call from the admin staff at my school. Where's your son? And my mom knows me really well. So like, that's not my son at all. I think you have the wrong person. And it indeed was the wrong person. They were just putting the bad David Martinez student's record onto the good David Martinez record. And I don't have a middle name, so no middle initial. So I started to use third. And that was, I think, the first time where I really began to understand the importance of Martinez as my last name and the history that it comes with. And certainly the connection to my grandfather, David Martinez Sr., my dad, Jr., and it's become almost kind of a badge of honor because I recognize that I carry my family's name and all that comes with it. They, of course, are Mexican American. I actually have Mexicans on both sides of my family. So I think that was a really first big connection I had with my own identity.
And so I love that you bring some of these things up, especially the importance of certain like the third, because language is such a big piece of today's conversation and the language that we use to describe ourselves. And so, before we jump into that, I do want to hear a little more about some of the perceptions as people, especially as you moved or as you had a different life experience, maybe, Jesse, as you moved to Michigan, how people lumped you together with other people of color or other people who may look like you. Based on your skin color, based on the way you sounded, based on your last name. And so if I can hear a little bit about perceptions and experiences as it relates to you and your identity. Jesse, we'll start with you.
So I think so when I moved to Michigan, I realized that at least in the area where I lived at, they thought that the only Hispanics that existed were Mexican. So I constantly had to correct people when they would be like, oh, you must like spicy food. And I'm like, well, wait a minute, that's like a stereotype. And I'm not sure if it applies to Mexicans, but like, I'm Puerto Rican. We don't like spicy food. Or like, and we are more like just regular rice, white rice. In good nature, right? They were just trying to be hospitable. And, but they would like think I was Mexican. And so that was some of the things that I constantly felt I was explaining to people that we're diverse groups. It's not just Mexicans. You have people from the islands. You have Puerto Ricans. You have Cubans, Dominicans. You have Mexican. You have Argentinians, Colombians, and we, even though we're one big group that have our similarities and our shared history, there's a lot of differences within the groups, and
Right.
so I had to constantly educate people about that. But then it was just like little things. Like all of a sudden, I went from New Jersey, where everybody could say Yesenia, to moving to Michigan, where people are just looking at my name, and in many instances, sometimes they would just call me Jenny, or if I was lucky, they would call me Jessica. So the unlucky days it would be Jessica, on unlucky days it would be Jenny. The last name is important. So I have a middle name. So my full name before I got married is Yesenia Milagros Pizarro's Sanchez. So of course they don't know how to fit your entire name and things like your ID or
Right.
or like human resources at the university. They were like, well, your name don't fit. And I'm like, well, you have to put my last name. And it was like, well, we only could put Yesenia Milagros. And I'm like, well, let's just cut.
Which one do you choose? Right.
Yeah, like just going back and forth in those things as my name. But as a professor teaching, one of the things that was also shocking to me, moving to the Midwest in a place where there were not that much Latinos, was the treatment, and the treatment that I got from students and the treatment that I got from colleagues. And I think that was very sobering to me, because as a graduate student teaching at Rutgers, there were a lot of students like me, and they were respectful. And what I found going to Michigan State was that I originally had a lot of problems because of I guess perceptions, and I hate to bring race here in the matter, but the fact that some people just didn't like the authority of a Latina woman
Right. Exactly.
in the classroom.
Exactly. Yeah.
So that was like a big slap in the face back when I started. I didn't expect that.
Well, David, any thoughts?
Yeah, and I'm actually now kind of reflecting on my answers to the first question, because thinking about my hometown more, which, if you know me, I am so proud to be from Marana. People ask me, where are you from? I say Marana, not Tucson. I'm native Arizonan, very proud. I'm a proud son of Arizona. And I think the segregation that existed in my hometown was more so based on income and poverty, but we know that that is all rooted in racial inequities. So certain populations lived in certain areas of Marana because that's what they could afford. And then oftentimes, as we know, that's how the system is built to keep our people down. So I think of a particular neighborhood of Marana called the Rejito, and that's where the African Americans and Black community live. It's in the shadow of a cement plant, which tells you really all you need to know about how placement works. So the perception is definitely real. And Yesenia, the name thing is so important to me, and I feel it in a different way. There are certainly enough boxes for David Martinez III as opposed to what you experience with but it's sort of like we have to fit into a box. It literally is a literal
Literally, yes.
we face with in our names. And I always put David Martinez III. It has become so part of my identity. And if I don't see it, then it's just weird. And then you're just my dad. You're just saying my dad because he doesn't use his suffix.
Or that other kid.
Yeah, and funnily enough, there's one story where somebody couldn't find my last name, or couldn't find my name on a roster. I can't even remember what they were looking for. And ironically, they found me in the I's because my suffix is just the third I.
Oh,
And
right.
they literally exclaimed, "ay," and everybody thought it was so funny. And I laughed too, because it was kind of funny, frankly. But you could tell it was kind of like a microaggression, kind of like ay, like a lot of Latinos complain. But and the person was white, but it was the naming is so important, and the perceptions that come with that. And even for my growing up, and the fact that I can't even think of a particular situation where kind of there was some misperceptions or challenge. That's me recognizing that I am an outward facing white person. My mother's maiden name is McCoy. My maternal grandfather, Eugene McCoy, grew up in Missouri and is of Irish ancestry. So definitely carry some privilege in that sense, that I am more white than I'm a white Mexican, if you will. And so privilege in that, and also just privilege in that while we were raised of pretty modest means. I honestly don't know how my parents did it, raising 6 kids with a single income household. My mom working so hard to take care of our kids in our home. And that we still had privilege, because I can't think of a time where we went hungry, where we didn't have clothes on our backs, where we always had a roof over our head. But also, it's because of great government assistance programs. We were always on free or reduced price lunch. I remember getting the food stamps and the checks through WIC, and going to the grocery store in Marana and choosing kind of the blocks of cheese and the milk that were WIC approved. And it's that sort of kind of community collaboration, I think, that's really needed more so now, in a good balance of public and private partnerships, not to get too technical on that.
No, for sure. No, I hear you. So some of the themes that you both just discussed, boxes specifically, and checking boxes and fitting into boxes, are kind of where I want to go next. And so thinking a little bit about the history and how it's progressed, and how the US has classified Latinos or Hispanics or Hispano Americanos, or whatever word you want to use at this point. And so, from the 1850s, when it was Hispano Americanos, to 100 years later, when it was Hispanic on the census. When I say those words, Hispano Americanos and Hispanic, does they signify anything to you? Do they mean anything to you? Is there an identity that any parallels with your identity that's connected there? David, what do you think?
Yeah, I think when I was growing up, I would click the Hispanic box, and certainly it still exists in a lot of cases. We just are completing the census now, and it's still a checkbox, though there are a lot more options now, recognizing that the term Hispanic is a lot more than just one entity from one country. Which is great. And if you haven't completed your census yet, please complete it. You have until September 30th.
An important plug, yes.
Yes, important plug. But yeah, I always kind of just clicked that Hispanic box and really didn't think too much of it. I am of Mexican descent, Mexican American, but never kind of said, I'm David Martinez, I'm Mexican American. I would always say Hispanic. I think I've evolved to use the word Latino. And that, as I'm sure we'll get to in a little bit, has even evolved more so. And as I've grown up, and especially as I went to the university, I saw just how wide a variety the Hispanic community is, and how that term itself is part of a bigger system that has tried to put people of color in different boxes for a lot of different reasons, and a lot of reasons rooted in injustices and inequities.
Right. Jesse, what are your thoughts?
It's very similar to David. I never really thought of much of it. It was just a box that I would check. I grew up, that was the term that was used, Hispanic. And then we evolved to Latino, and now I've also now evolved to use the term Latinx. But I think as a Puerto Rican, it's a little bit different for us, because although some people don't realize this, Puerto Ricans are U.S. citizens.
Right.
Yes, I sometimes have to educate people about that, because so I've been privileged in that I'm not really an immigrant, and I've always been, like, in my passport or whenever I traveled back and forth to the islands, I never had to deal with any of that. any of the things that other Latinx people deal with, and officially I'm an American, like in my passport and everything. Right. So I think it's different for us Puerto Ricans. But one of the things I have to say about Puerto Ricans is that we generally love being Puerto Rican. So I could tell you about my parents. They wouldn't even put Hispanic. They would just write in Puerto Rican.
Right.
That's what I am. So yeah, so that's been my experience with that type of labeling.
Yeah, as I've jumped into learning about just kind of the trajectory of where this, if there is a trajectory, is it linear, or are there other little pipelines that people take when it comes to identity? And I've read a lot about people identifying with their own race or ethnicity. I think that and perhaps the census has done a disservice in continuing to change or to add or to take away some of these race and ethnic categories as the last 2 centuries have gone by. But going into kind of similar question, but as Hispanic has changed to Latino and reasons for it. And just for a little background, the word Hispanic, some people thought that it was too close to Spanish and the colonialism of the Spaniards, in addition to not including in a way that elevated both Afro-Latinas and people that were indigenous. And so that's something that I learned in like learning about where the Hispanic origins come from. And so there was this shift to Latino. So same question, but about the word Latino. I know, David, you talked a little bit about this word in your last thought, but anything else you'd like to add in terms of that relation and that identity, as it's are there differences in where you would use Hispanic versus Latino, or how does that word mean something different to you?
Yeah, I think this is kind of like an underlying thing. It's a self-selection kind of thing. Sometimes we are put into certain boxes and are forced to check certain boxes. And Yesenia, I'm so glad that you your family puts in other Puerto Rico. That is so important. And you can't do that on the census too, because it's important that we're counted and that we know that that the term Hispanic or Latino does erase a lot of cultural history that's super important. Especially my maternal grandmother, she's a Villa, and it's basically like the US border crossed them and their family. And even their roots have indigenous backgrounds. It's hard to track because the records weren't kept, but I'm doing my best through research and historical societies that shows that on my mom's side of the family, my maternal grandmother have history all the way back to Cochise and the indigenous people of what's now Southeast Arizona. And that's awesome. And that's not at all encapsulated in the word Hispanic or Latino.
Right.
And I think erases a lot of the richness of our culture. And even if it's just like Mexican, like northern Mexico is so different than central Mexico and like right. areas around Mexico City. And I think that's what I appreciate about our culture so much, is that the Spanish speaking world is so diverse. Even if you think about like the Philippines as opposed to Mexico or Spain and all the great countries of Central America, right. we have so much to celebrate. And unfortunately, because of boxes and terms like Hispanic or Latino, a lot of that is erased. So I'm really glad when people choose to identify however they would like, whether it be Hispanic or Latino or Colombiano or whatever it is, right. that reflects what you're bringing to the table and who you are as a person.
Yesenia, what are your thoughts?
I agree. And now you just made me want to from now on, and I'm not even checking them. Just be like my parents and write Puerto
Rican. So hearing about all of that, and kind of going into a little bit more about the word Latinx. And so I would just, before diving in, when you first heard it, or if you remember how you first heard it, some of your first reactions to it, what were they? And Dr. Pizarro, let's start with you.
I thought I'm embarrassed to say this. This is an actual true
Safe
story.
space, safe
So,
space.
I saw the term for the first time probably like I would say 10 years ago. I joined the Latinx network in criminology. So there's a network of Latinx criminologists, and this was in the beginning when they were starting and they were like writing the charter. And I remember, I'm embarrassed about this, I thought it was a typo. So I corrected it. I thought, so that was my first experience with this. And they were writing the charter and I corrected it. And then they were like, no, this is actually purposeful. It's X, and they explained it to me. So then I understood, but it's one of those things like I think when you're socialized in a way of always saying Latina, Latino, Hispanic, it's been hard for me to like start using the term because it's just ingrained in your
Right, right.
psyche, right? And a lot of times now, I am appreciative because it is so much more inclusive and it recognizes particularly the non-binary folks and stuff, and I think is very important. But I catch myself making mistakes all the time, and I have to sometimes take a step back and be a lot more conscientious of the language that I'm using and making sure that I'm using I'm using language that is exclusive. Um, but I'm working on it, but at least I'm not correcting it as a typo now.
I love that story, and I do have a quick follow up, related to how it was explained to you when they said this isn't a typo. Do you remember how they explained it to you? Because this was in its infancy. I feel like the word, and because it was making its round first in academic circles and then more with like pop culture and social media. So do you remember how it was explained to you?
They just mentioned that they wanted to use a term that was that included everyone, and because of gender issues, and some people are not comfortable with the word Latino because of the colonization aspect of it. So it was explained to me in a nice, gentle manner, and I was like, oh, okay. So I'm thankful for that person who introduced me to it.
Right.
So what I try to tell people, like my husband, so I married an American white guy. It's like I'm a lot I'm forgiven when I forgive him, and I'm very forgiven with people who are trying that sometimes may use the wrong terms, because as a Puerto Rican Latinx myself, I use the wrong terms sometimes because so yeah, so I try to do to others what was done to me, like
Right.
educate in a loving way.
Right. No, that's an important thing to remember as educators of not only the movement, but of our culture and things that we ourselves prefer when it comes to our own identity. David, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I say I use the word Latino more to self-identify myself, but certainly respect whatever term different folks prefer. And I see Latinx more. I think when I first heard it, I can't remember where particularly it was, but I was kind of thrown off by it as well. For another funny reason, not so much a typo, but I grew up with the lisp and having to take speech therapy because I slur my S's, and X is an S sound. So when I use Latinx, it just seems like I'm slurring my word, the ending of that. So I tried to use the @ symbol for a while, and I saw that be used in different instances. And I think it goes to kind of the conversation around using Latinx and how it's just a really hard word to say, and it doesn't conjugate. So how are we supposed to use it in every vernacular? And I think that's okay. I think that's part of this journey that we're on with equity and learning more, and everybody is on their own journey, and certainly we have to hold each other accountable and in a respectful and kind way, as you were saying, Jasenia, call each other out and say, actually, I prefer to use this term or that term. That's kind of it. I also think back to actually in college, when I first started to hear it more, one of my formative experiences was hanging out at the Student Center for Hispanic or Latino kids, and it was called the Chicano Hispano Student Affairs. So even that was like, wow,
more words, yeah.
into past words, and I think it's still called that. I don't know if they changed their name. They might have had some naming rights, but it just tells you how much the wording and the journey has evolved and changed in the past 10 plus years on this. I think again, we have to give each other a little bit of grace as we move on this journey, but certainly hold each other accountable, because self-identity is important. As I mentioned earlier, like if I don't see the third on my name, I asked for you to include it, sure. And kindly, of course, and because it's so important to what I bring to the table and into the rooms and spaces, and just appreciate when people appreciate that.
For sure. And so now I do want to touch on a subject that I've seen a lot of commentary on online. It's just the some of the roots of Latinx, and especially around the Spanish language and it being a gendered language. And so some people feel like, with some of the words. And so this was illustrated for me in a literal visual that I'm just gonna, describe here. A group of Latinas in a room, doesn't matter how many there are, as soon as one man enters, all of a sudden it's Latinos. How do we feel about some of the misogyny and some of the more gendered aspects of the language, and that being, one of the reasons people do want to use Latinx, because it doesn't gender the language in the way that it has been used. Yesenia, what are your thoughts?
I think it's one of those things that you don't really think about it, especially if this has been ingrained in you since you were a child. So you're like kind of programmed, socialized to it, that you don't really realize it until someone points it out, right? And sometimes, or a change occurs, and then you're like, oh, that's a good point. That's actually messed up. I just never realized it, because as a society, sometimes we're socialized in such a way that we don't recognize the inequities or the injustices because we're so used to it. That's right. What we see every day, and it becomes part of like what we think it's normal. So yeah.
David, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, Danny, I love that visual that you use with like a group of Latinas in a room, and one Latino comes in, and all of a sudden the language has to be changed. Yeah. To take care of the one man in the room. It could be like a brilliant woman, and it just boggles my mind, and it just shows you how gender is infused in language, especially in languages like Spanish and other Romantic languages, and I think it's kind of rooted in, as you mentioned, the misogyny that exists in different cultures. I mean, growing up, when we got together as family, often for barbecues or whatnot, the guys would all go outside and kind of just hang out and chill and maybe drink some beers. And then the women would stay inside, most likely in the kitchen. And it just kind of persists in this kind of sort of segregation that happens within our culture. The whole concept of machismo as well is really, really rampant. I say this especially is challenging for me because I'm an out gay man. So I was growing up, I'm like, I kind of want to be outside and like hang out with my moms and my tia and just like hang out in there. But then I felt pressure to go outside and hang out with the guys and my tios and my dad and my brothers. And I know my place, and it just shows you just how challenging it is and can be. Even just words matter. Because kids like me growing up had such a challenging time and really didn't know how to process it. Ultimately, they kind of just allowed me to do what I wanted to do. And if I wanted to stay inside, sure. And maybe my nana would say like, you're supposed to be outside in Spanish, but like I have a loving family. My parents are so supportive of my activism in the LGBTQ movement and for equality. But the fact that language is gendered is still astonishing to me. And it's not just a Spanish language. And it just shows you just how programmed systems are and our world is to see things in a binary system when we know things like gender are not in a binary system, and that we have to reflect changes and acknowledge that it's not just a two system.
No. So the very, very there's so much in those comments that I'm like reflecting on, being like, oh man, like things that are kind of gross when I think about it, and things that are kind of like you know, where was my place too, you know, and thinking of the people who not only have the similar struggles, but different or deeper like struggles with those things. Where do they fit within, you know, this spectrum or this umbrella, if you will? And so I want to just for the sake of putting information out there, I want to read the definition of Latinx. And so one definition says a person of Latin American origin or descent used as a gender neutral or non-binary alternative to Latino or Latina. And then this, and the next one is kind of similar to that. And so I'm thinking of that. I want to, part of my next question is, when is the term appropriate? And that's actually some of the questions that are coming in from the Facebook Live. And so, so one of the questions is, what, when, and how is the term appropriate? And so let's thinking a little bit about when to use the term. I think that through this conversation, not necessarily established, but there's a common theme here, that the term is used on a basis when the people using it feel like it's appropriate. There isn't a fast rule that says that this, you know, always using it, or that we have shifted to it. But in reading some of the growth in the word, reading Hispanic nonprofits or Hispanic lobbying organizations who are advocating for the advancement of Hispanic populations, how else do you include an agenda that's all encompassing? While there may be differences, as you know, pointed out throughout this conversation, are there other types of examples you can think of in which the term should be used?
I would say, you know, I try to use it all the time now, and sometimes I might forget, but if you're I just think that this should probably be the term that should be adopted.
Yeah.
And let's just start using it. And
Yeah.
if in doubt, then when in doubt, just use it.
I think that's how I shifted my frame of thinking as well, because I don't think I had been using it before this year, to be honest. I'd seen it, but hadn't one educated myself on the need. And this was also coming from an out gay man. Had also not thought of the racial, historical reasons, but also the LGBTQ inclusive reasons on why folks were using it. And so, David, do you have thoughts on perhaps when the word should be used, if not, you know, at all times, or when possible?
Yeah, I kind of see it in two different ways. You'll see in my name, I put my preferred gender pronouns. You might hear PGP, or just gender nouns that you want to, that as an individual you prefer folks use. So as my gender identity is as a man, my expression is more masculine, and my sex is a male. So those are kind of my gender identities, and that's my preferred gender pronouns are he, him, his. I see it as that kind of same way with an individual. So when I use it freely as my identity, I just say Latino, but also recognize that there's an evolution in the wording to Latinx. So that's fine. So just where you're at and what you prefer to use it.
That's a great role. Yeah.
The society and more how we use it externally. And I think we will see this movement to use Latinx more because of everything that we've been talking about. And I think it all comes down to how it's used. So if it's a place of kindness, of love, or of hate, which we recognize completely possible in our world today, unfortunately. So I think we just have to recognize that some people are at different places in this journey with what word that they prefer. And we just have to show each other a bit more kindness, love, and grace in the journey if it comes from a place of love. If it's coming from a place of hate, then that's a whole separate conversation that,
For sure.
that you need to do on yourself.
I hear that. Do you think there's a difference when we acknowledge the community versus individuals within the community? And how do you think we should approach those types of conversations?
Yeah, I love this because I think I think this is where we'll start seeing Latinx be used more because it's more inclusive. I'm even seeing an evolution of words away from African American to Black and capital B Black and people owning their Blackness. I love that. Like, I am proud to be Black. I am proud to be Latino, Latinx. Really embracing your culture. And I think that we're going to see a continued evolution with this. And as groups and communities, you'll start being referred to in a more inclusive way. And it comes down to, again, how folks really see themselves and embracing their identity. And I do think we should embrace our identity more.
I know, I love that. I love that. Dr. Pizarro, do you have any thoughts on that?
I agree. You took the words out of my mouth, David.
Yeah. And so there's another question that came in from Facebook Live that I'm going to read. So I'm going to just read it all here. So I will call people what they prefer, but my Latina college roommate, parentheses, where the question came in, the one who helps me understand the complexities in Latino culture, close parentheses, a progressive career PD, hates the term with a passion. She's 44 and feels that the term ignores her cultural and linguistic history. I find the term more accepted with younger people. The question is, for me, how to use the term when appropriate and in a manner that doesn't offend. Either of you want to take this one?
I would just be respectful to her wishes, right? So David, you touched on that earlier, like how does she identify, and then be respectful of her wishes when I'm referring about her or I'm referring to her. So this is where it can get complicated because some people have different preferences and but just be respectful of that with her.
For sure.
Yeah, and this generational difference is really interesting because I think you do see a lot of older Hispanics. They really embrace the word Hispanic, and kind of the more younger generation embracing the term Latinx. Right. And I think that says a lot about where our country is moving. The fact that Latinos are growing in population, and all in education knows this. It's a majority of kids in our classrooms now are Latinx. And that's the future of Arizona. It's going to be the future of America. But it doesn't mean we have to, as your friend that's 44 has to lose their identity. And you can click the box Latinx or Latino or Hispanic and still embrace your own cultural identity wherever your family may be from. That is so important because even though we are this melting pot of a country, many people say we're more of like a salad mix where everything kind of stays whole, but together. That's kind of how I see the country. And it's not just one monolithic American culture, it's many different cultures. And I think that is something that we really have to continue to embrace and actually promote, because as we know, there's a really big movement actually that's infusing hate in throughout our communities. And that's not just a political statement. That's actually a statement that I think is eroding our communities and our country.
Right. And so I think many times when we are looking for answers that especially as language evolves, we want like a clear, like one point, one sentence, like rule that, you know, sets all the boundaries, sets all the, you know, parameters on when and where and why and how to use a certain word without being offended, you know, to not offend anybody. When at the same time, all these points you're making are, I think, it's a balance, in essence, a balancing act, but at the same time, it's you're weighing your own values and the values of the community. When it comes to weighing unity versus, you know, your own identity, you know, and you know, going to David's example there, in you know, this state, you know, which one is more paramount, that, you know, that you use that apostrophe on my last name, or that, you know, the accent on my last name, or that you know, or that we are, you know, unified with one message, that promotes, like, you know, love over hate. And I think that there's a time and a place, I think, for many of these things, but I think that just knowing and asking is, you know, I think some of the themes that we're seeing here, especially when it comes to the evolution of how we as a community are identified and how we as a community see ourselves. And so so with that, I ask for any final thoughts on Latinx. Anything you'd like to add?
I think on my part, I've covered.
Okay, so
Yeah, I'll just add really quickly, there was a comment about kind of Hispanic institutions and how institutions like Phoenix College, and I know my alma mater, University of Arizona, is a Hispanic institution, serving institution as well. Those are all governmental terms, right? Hispanic is once again being used by the US Department of Education,
right,
to ensure that our community is getting its fair share of resources, and that institutions like Phoenix College are doing the great work that they're doing to outreach to our community. At the end of the day, if it's Latinx serving institution, awesome. I just want to ensure that our people are receiving the resources that we deserve, and that we're proving people wrong. So complete the 12th grade, graduate from high school, go on to post-secondary education, if that's in your cards, whether that mean a college or university or trade school, just prove people wrong.
love that, love that.
Yeah.
Well, on that note, you know, thank you both for being a part of this conversation on Latinx. Before we close, though, we have a tradition with Que Sepas, and we always ask you know, 2 questions of our panelists. So the first question is about the Loteria game. So if you're familiar with the Loteria game, it's like a Latinx bingo, if you will, and they're traditional icons that exist on the card. And so what we're asking our panelists is, if you could replace any of those icons with your own cultural icon, whatever it may be, what would it be? Any thoughts?
It's hard, right? I have a couple, but I have a couple, so I want to like add 3 people. But I'm gonna go old school, and I would say Rita Moreno. Rita Moreno is an iconic Puerto Rican. She won an Oscar. She has won all kinds of awards. I'm drawing a blank now, but like she paved the way for people like Jennifer Lopez and all the wonderful Latinx and Latinas that are out in Hollywood now. Without Rita Moreno, there wouldn't be the other ones that are now. So
that is a great one. Yes. I love Rita Moreno. Still follow her. Love watching her acceptance speech and hearing her talk about it. It's she's iconic, no, for sure. David, what about you?
I would gladly put my bean on the Rita Moreno. I love that answer. That's so good. I think I would have to, my card would be probably a great Arizonan and former ambassador, Raul Castro, former governor of Arizona, who broke all expectations and became the first Latinx governor of Arizona, then went on to serve as ambassador for the country, which is incredible because he's an immigrant. He was not born in the country and was raised in Southern Arizona, and just, I think, embodies what Arizona is and what our community can accomplish. I'll also add that even as he just was living his life in Southern Arizona, still faced discrimination and would be pulled over by Border Patrol because he was wearing a fancy suit and was was brown. And even though he served as governor of our state, as an ambassador to our country, and he was like in his 90s when this was happening, and he passed away a while ago. But I know that his legacy lives on, and certainly through this Loteria game.
Well, awesome, awesome. Thank you. And then the last question is going to be La Chancla. If you could throw La Chancla at anything, whatever entity, a thought, movement, or whatever the case might be. And La Chancla, for those not familiar, is simply just a sandal, many times made of leather or tire, that your parents used as a disciplinary tool as kids. And so, what would you throw La Chancla at? What would you cancel, just based on your feelings here and now today? David, we'll start with you.
Yeah, and sometimes that chancla would have a goat head or a thorn, if you're familiar with the desert, and it's not fun when you get hit by one. Sorry, Mom, if you're watching. I would say I would throw a chancla at this. I'm going to go really kind of high level with this, because I think we're seeing now the importance of our connectedness as community, and not just through our identities, but just the simple fact of knowing your neighbor. So I am going to throw a chancla at you not knowing your neighbor. So I challenge everybody to meet your neighbor, because that simple task of just getting to know that person is a community building tactic, and shows that we are more than just our own little bubble. We are part of something greater. And that is so important today, because obviously of the global pandemic, we have to take care of each other. Please wear a mask. And it also will build greater community, which I think would benefit our entire country, because our democracy literally is at stake for the November election. So I will throw a chancla at you not knowing your neighbor. Please meet your neighbor.
All right.
I love that. I'm gonna go pretty broad too on and I would throw the chancla at the current political climate. There's just so much divisiveness, and it's worrisome, because we as people living in this country have a lot more in common than we would like to believe. So, throw the chancla at all the negativity that we're hearing out there politically, and it's time for us to come together as one community and do what we were meant to do, like look out for each other, be kind to one another, and let's throw the chancla at the divisive rhetoric coming out right now.
Love all of that. Dr. Pizarro, David, thank you so much for joining us for episode 2 of Que Sepas. So grateful for your feedback and your commitment to seeing that our community advances in the way that it deserves to. Until next time, thank you all. Have a great day.
Thanks. Bye.